Just what is the true story behind the stream, the reservoir, and the town that is named Hungry Horse? Let's find out.
It's certainly plausible that Tex and Jerry got stuck out there in one of those early snowstorms, and how they got lost and they couldn't get them out, because the only way to get them out would be in the break trail, and they had all these guys. They had to get people out safe and sound. And
it probably snowed even more, and then they couldn't get back there to search for them or to find them.
My dad commissioned the famous Hungry Horse painter Ace Powell to make a replication of the Hungry Horses. And I really love it. I think it's very realistic. But it had this brown mountain in the background, which nothing around here looks like that. So I took this and I put Great Northern Mountain in the back, and I've got it on a t-shirt, and it's dynamite. Josiah had a big one get off a couple of times, but this time he's got a big one. Well, we don't know how big, but it's a pretty good fish.
Pretty decent. I'm using a decent amount of strength. He's fighting.
Nice.
Yeah, he took it and moved it upstream. I could see it move.
We are up here at Hungry Horse Creek, and this is where Tex and Jerry, this general vicinity between here and Great Northern Mountain, had to get abandoned when the 3-foot snow came. I've taken a lot of beautiful fish out of this particular hole. It is a good size one, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I first hooked it, it just stayed, man. It didn't go nowhere. Tex and Jerry were big-boned horses designed for pulling out logs in the Hungry Horse Reservoir. Yet when they were finally recovered, they were skin and bones. It took the most careful of nursing to bring them back to a sense of health at all. Now, when something has taken place 123 years ago, it's hard to get the exact perfect truth.
Well, I'm here with Dennis O'Connor. He's an old-timer here in this trapline area. So I'm going to tell you the version that my father passed down to me about the Hungry Horses, and then we'll have Dennis share details and a version that he has heard. My dad, Jim Willows, homesteaded in Montana in Fairfield in about 1934. The tales were amazing. Just him in a truck and all these weasels. About 180 weasels tried to kill all his chickens the first night, and he shot, I believe he told me, 180. And other times there were packs of coyotes that would herd his whole flock of geese into a little ravine so they could feast on them as they willed. At other times the weather was so severe they had to burn the furniture to survive. But Dad proved up on his 640 square mile homestead, sold it, and came to Hungry Horse in, I think, about 1941. Now, at that time, they were starting to talk about logging out this Hungry Horse reservoir that is behind me. So Dad got a couple of Army surplus Studebaker 6-wheel drive trucks, and he converted them to logging trucks. And he got a great contract to come all the way down into this reservoir and log out the timber. He said that's some of the best money he ever made. He made $36,000 in the early 1940s. But I figure my dad that came here in the early 1940s probably has a more accurate version of the story than others, because it was only 40-some years before he came that it happened. You know how stories change with time, and now today it's 123 years from the incident. It could be a lot of variation. So here's what my dad told me. Here we are today at Hungry Horse Creek. And what Dad said is somewhere between here and Great Northern Mountain, they were doing some horse logging. And a couple of big husky horses named Tex and Jerry were pulling these logs out of the forest. Dad said a big snow came. It was the year of 1900 or possibly early 1901. And it really snowed, like 3 feet of snow. And the guys tried their best to break the trail for the horses, but the horses just could not break their way through that 3-foot snow. So there was no other choice than to take the halters off them and leave them to fend for themselves while the men went out on snowshoes. According to Dad's version, they came to look for them in the spring, and they found them so malnourished, and they named this stream Hungry Horse Creek, then named the reservoir Hungry Horse Reservoir, and the town followed suit. Imagine those horses making it through the winter, rummaging around in that 3 feet plus snow just to eat little ends of willow trees and whatever they could find. But Dennis found some information that was a little bit different. Now, what was your story?
Well, the only difference between one story and the other is that the horses had wandered up and they had followed the line of the what is now the East Side Road, because that was an easy place to traverse from a Hungry Horse Creek.
Okay.
And they got up and they wandered up into the area which is now the township area, town of Hungry Horse. That's what I heard. But I mean, because there were trappers that were around here right at that time.
Sure.
They found these horses, but it was in the spring I heard that they found them.
Oh, in the spring. Now,
Yeah.
you the version you heard said that they basically wandered into kind of what is FK&L.
Yes.
Well, that's the mill that my dad hauled into, FK&L.
Yeah, because that would have been the area where people were.
One version of the story is that once spring came and the snow was passable, that the horses came down through here, which is called the FK&L area, and wandered into Martin City and then the Hungry Horse area, and they were found. Of course, there was no road at that time.
Yeah,
And so they probably heard somebody and they wandered into that, and that's relatively close to Hungry Horse.
Yeah.
And so
Just a couple miles on the other side of Martin City,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
And so they were.
You heard they wandered in there in the spring, and they found the ghosts
because they
of
couldn't get
horses.
out in the winter, essentially. So they probably, when it started to melt a little bit, probably, in April or March, when the snows got so they could get along a little bit better and they didn't have so much to wade through, then they were able to wander up and they heard noise and they wandered toward these people, and all of a sudden there were these two horses. There's Tex and Jerry all of a sudden.
There's the horses all of a sudden.
But they freaking survived, and they've made a sculpture of them. And
in the early days, Blake the woodcarver created this rather unique kind of persona of a bony, hungry horse.
The tails were hanging down. They had no pride left to them. They were just gaunt.
Wow,
Is what they were.
Gaunt,
But they did get them. They did nurse them back to health.
Yeah, and did they live and just put them out to pasture?
I think that's what happened. I don't think they logged with them
nuts.
anymore. But logging with horses at that time was a big deal. And, And the thing about that time when he was talking about that snowstorm, there's an old timer around here who he knows. His name is Gene Brash, and him and his parents used to go back out into the great what is now the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, and they used to go out there hunting in the middle of September every year for goats when the goat season would start. And they wouldn't come out until the 1st of December every year.
Wow.
And they'd come out with 3 deer and 3 elk and a bear or 2 if they had the license for them, and 3 goats every year.
Every year.
And there's pictures of them coming out. You've undoubtedly seen it with that truck with all the animals hanging off the truck. And they did that from 1941 until 1970. There was very little traffic out there because the dam for the Hungry Horse Road wasn't out there. So you had to start from Martin City. And so those horses had to get back as far as camp there, or Martin City was the first of people. That's the only place they were.
Right.
And so anyhow, that's what all I know about a little bit about the history of this place and how that snowstorm is certainly possible, because Brash is telling me they used to come out of there and snow up to their waist.
Wow.
Sometime the 1st of December. And they would break the trails. They had 3 pack horses.
Yeah.
And they would break the trails for the pack horses, so the pack horses would go out and they'd go 10 miles a day coming out.
Yeah.
And they break 10 miles of trail and then walk out. But you can imagine walking from clear back in there all the way to Martin City afoot, breaking trail for horses in waist deep snow. So that's
crazy.
what those horses
They
had.
would break trail with their own selves?
Yeah. The only way they could do it. And so they had snowshoes. So that's why it's certainly plausible that Tex and Jerry got stuck out there in one of those early snowstorms, and how they got lost and they couldn't get them out, because the only way to get them out would be in the break trail, and they had all these guys. They had to get people out safe and sound. And
it probably snowed even more, and then they couldn't get back there to search for them or to find them. But Dennis, there was trappers that I knew. I had a pretty good friend that was a trapper up around Spotted Bear, even as late as the 70s.
Oh,
and
yeah,
he'd
sure.
go back in there on a snowmobile, and he'd trap all winter long for coyote, mink, marten,
There's still
beaver,
do.
whatever.
There's guys still do, one or two.
There's one or two that still
Yeah,
do.
they still do. And
Wow.
that's a long, and you know, they used to go back into that, those trappers that used to be up in here in this country, they used to go back in, you know, clear back to the cliffs, the limestone cliffs and all that. And you can find, Gene and I have found these old little places they crawl into, they built. They built these little places, they'd be like 3 feet wide and about 3 feet tall and about 6 feet, 7 feet long, and that's where they'd sleep.
That by the China Wall in the Bob, or where?
No, it's by the limestone cliffs on the way. If you go to Pentagon and you wide the trail out away from Pentagon, the limestone cliffs are one of the first things. You hit the big wave of cliffs there. But on the other side of that, Lone Butte and in that country, they used to get out in there, and there used to be these old trappers places where these guys, and they go, when they do their trap line, they had built several of these so they could go from one to the other in their trap line. They snowshoe.
Wow.
But they didn't have any snowmobiles to do this with.
Yeah.
This was all afoot.
That's
And
back
then
in
now
the
you
old
got
days.
your furs and your everything. You got to get out of there in the spring. Can you imagine what that was like? These guys were
Yeah.
tougher than nails, boy.
Boy, they would be.
But anyhow, that's the story I know about. And this country's got so much history. And I'm sure you sell the book. The river runs through it. This guy wrote a story of this history of this area. He worked for the state, and he's written 3 books now. But one of them is on the history of this area, when the railroad was coming in and how they found the pass and how they set up Columbia Falls, and there's a lot of history here.
Well, you know, they used to call, and they still nickname this area, Hungry Horse, Martin City, and Quorum, the trap line.
Right.
Because years ago, this was actually a really good trap line. In among the rivers, the Middle Fork coming down and the South Fork and everything, it was a heck of a trap line. Even in my growing up here in Hungry Horse, there was my neighbor right back here. He shot a 360-pound grizz in his yard. I had 3 bears in my yard last fall, and I was kind of feeding them because of the terrible huckleberry crop. I almost ran into a big blonde bear fishing on the South Fork. There's a lot of activity, and it was a great trap line right where we live right now.
It still could be.
Yeah, it still could be.
There's still guys trapped Desert Mountain, you know.
Is there?
Until 3 or 4 years ago, yeah, they trapped marten up there and stuff.
Martin up there.
Yeah.
Wow.
The guy who owned the Dewdrop, you know, the older guy, when he's off, he sold it now, but Clanton. Old Clanton, he used to trap here until probably 7 years ago when he had his heart attack, 8 years ago.
No.
But he had a snowmobile.
He did.
And you could find them. You can still find the marten traps up on the trees and stuff.
Can you? Wow.
You know, this area is really something. I mean, anybody that Northwest Montana, you come up here and you come to places like his here at the Huckleberry place. These Huckleberry things are amazing. I mean, they do a really good job with their Huckleberry stuff, and this place has great food, and they've got a lot of customers in the summertime. They appreciate
Yeah, we
this
do
place.
over 1,000 a day.
I know.
So I've interviewed several locals around here that claim that they had a Sasquatch sighting. Did you ever hear
I've
of
never
any?
known. You know, I'll tell you something. I have ridden 450 miles horseback into Bob Marshall over a period of 4 years. And I have literally been in every part. I have a 4-wheeler that I drive from Hungry Horse, Montana, over to North Idaho. And I usually do that a couple of times a year. And it's about a 380 to 390 mile round trip. And so I travel from Hungry Horse all the way through the western mountains here. I go up by Pole Bridge and go west from there, all the way to Idaho, through the Purcells and the Salish Mountains. And I have never seen anything like that. I've got a lot of pictures of the back end of black bears.
Yeah.
Because they run off from you, but I do that at least once a year and sometimes twice.
Do you really? That's an interesting route. I was very skeptical about Bigfoot myself because I've lived here all my life. I've extensively hiked. I've hiked from Montana clear to Canada. I've hiked and cross-country skied at least 4,000 miles in this country. And I've never for sure seen a track, and I haven't seen a Bigfoot. But you know, I've interviewed a number of people, especially over on the Blackfeet Reservation, that claim that they have seen Bigfoot.
On the other side of the mountains.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I got this 4-wheeler. I don't want to tell you too much, but just let him, he hikes 4,000 miles. I do a lot of photography, and I've got a 4-wheeler that I sold last year that I had 10,000 miles on.
Wow.
That has all been here in Northwest Montana. So everybody tells you there's nowhere to go. There's lots of places to go if you go there carefully and you mind your business and you follow the rules. But when you start going from here to Idaho and back and taking these long rides, and then you go down by Sealy, and there's lots of places down there at the tail end of the Scapegoat, and there's lots of places around here to go and ride.
So what's the most interesting animal you saw in all that riding around?
Well, you see a lot of moose and bear, and you see a lot of elk.
Yeah.
And you know, you see, it's kind of interesting to sit and watch them, you know, once in a while.
Yeah.
But up the North Fork, you know, there's still some pretty good herds of elk, you know, that are still up that way. And I ride from here to the Canadian border all the time, or I go up to, you know, up inside the park, or stay inside the park and go up to the lakes up there, Kitla Lake and stuff. But, you know, anybody who comes into this area is not going to be disappointed.
That's true.
Whether it's stories like Tex and horses, Tex, or whatever it is around here. But there's a lot of history and a lot of things to do and a lot of interesting people. So,
Well, thanks for your time.
you're welcome.
We
Thank you.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.